Just a Band-Aid queen. That's what they called her in the break room, voices low enough that she wouldn't hear, loud enough that she would. Elena Martinez pushed the med cart down the third-floor corridor of Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston, her shoes making no sound on the linoleum, her presence making less. 3 years. 3 years of 6 a.m. shifts and overtime nobody asked her to take, 3 years of for-starts and wound care and holding the hands of patients who'd forgotten their own children's names. 3 years of silence about the life before Sacred Heart, the life she'd buried in desert sand and military bureaucracy and a medical discharge that still lived in a locked drawer in her apartment. The stairwell door opened on the second landing. Elena took the stairs instead of the elevator, always the stairs, though nobody noticed the slight favor in her left leg, the way her shoulder pulled tight when she reached for supplies on high shelves. Her hands never trembled. That was the thing about trauma, it either broke you completely or it taught you to move with absolute certainty. There was no middle ground. Her fingers found veins in the dark, needles sliding in on first stick with a precision that made residents watch her with something between envy and confusion. How does the floor nurse do that? They'd whisper. Must be luck. Luck was muscle memory. Luck was 4,000 hours in a trauma tent in Ramadi watching surgeons work under fire, learning to anticipate the next move before the body made it. Luck was the difference between a patient living to tell the story and becoming one. Room 12 needed restocking. Elena pushed the cart inside, began rotating the supply rotation with hands that moved on their own, gauze, syringes, alcohol pads, tape. Everything in its place. Everything ready. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above her head, that constant buzz that made the bones in your inner ear ache if you listened too long. She didn't listen. She'd learned to hear through the hum, to catch the subtle sounds that mattered, the change in a ventilator's rhythm that meant something was wrong, the way a monitor's beep shifted in tone when a patient's oxygen was dropping, the soft whisper of a blood pressure cuff inflating that told her the pressure was already changing before the numbers came up. She was stocking the crash cart supplies when she felt him watching. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway, his tablet glowing with the cool light of someone important reviewing the unimportant. His shoes were leather, expensive-looking leather, the kind that hadn't spent much time walking the floors of a hospital. He was tall, the sort of man who made doorways seem smaller just by standing in them, his white coat pristine, his silver hair swept back like a magazine advertisement for competence. He looked at Elena the way someone looks at furniture, noted the presence, calculated the utility, moved on. Martinez. Not a question. Not quite a greeting. Elena turned, her expression neutral. Doctor. We have an incoming trauma. His eyes never left his tablet. Navy SEAL, training accident, ETA for minutes. Multiple internal injuries, likely hemorrhagic shock. I'll be running the resuscitation. Understood. Elena's voice came out steady, professional, exactly the way a floor nurse should sound. The way she'd learned to sound. Ashford turned away, his shoes clicking on the tile with that sharp, precise rhythm that meant authority, that meant he'd never had to question where he belonged. Elena stood alone in room 12, her hands finishing the supply rotation even though her mind had gone somewhere else. Navy SEAL. Ramadi. For minutes. The numbers gathered in her chest like weather systems before a storm. She went to the break room because that's what nurses did between codes. Sit. Eat something. Pretend everything was normal. The room smelled like the industrial coffee that came from the machine that made everyone's teeth hurt, antiseptic, burnt, with an undertone of something chemical that might have been milk substitute. Elena unwrapped a sandwich she'd made that morning, turkey and mustard on wheat, and sat in the corner where she could see the door. The younger nurses came in with that energy they had, the ones who hadn't yet learned that hospitals aged you in years instead of seasons. Jessica, the OR tech, was talking about her boyfriend's truck. Michaela, fresh out of school, was laughing at something someone had said in the hallway. They were good nurses, both of them. Elena had watched them work, had seen the way they cared for patients, the way they'd stay late if someone needed them. That was enough. That was the real thing. Did you see the Band-Aid Queen's hands today? Someone, Elena thought it was Marcus from the day's shift, had come in, his voice carrying that particular timbre of someone about to tell a joke at someone else's expense. Started and 4 on Mr. Patterson in room 6. He was crashing. 1 stick. No flashlight, no second attempt. Just, he snapped his fingers. Done. Jessica giggled. Nervous, uncertain giggle. That's actually amazing. Amazing is one word. Marcus laughed, and the sound had teeth in it. Lucky is another. Third word is boring, because all she does is show up, do the same thing every day, never says anything, never asks for anything. Who even is she? Like, do we know anything about Elena? Michaela shrugged. She's nice. Nice is for people who don't have ambition. Marcus leaned against the counter, his own tablet in hand because everyone had tablets now. Nice is what you are when you've given up on everything else. Elena sat very still. Her sandwich was halfway to her mouth. Her face showed nothing, which was a kind of showing everything if you knew how to read it. The younger nurses had sense enough to go quiet, to look away, to suddenly become very interested in their phones. Marcus didn't have that sense. Marcus had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, from a family that knew people, from a trajectory that had never bent. He turned to leave, his voice carrying back over his shoulder. Band-Aid Queen. That's what we're calling her now. It's accurate. Elena finished her sandwich. She drank her coffee even though it was cold now, the taste bitter and sharp. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The tremor that wanted to live in her chest, the one that recognized the sound of someone diminishing you, the particular cruelty of being made invisible and then mocked for your invisibility, she locked that down the way she'd locked down everything else. The overhead system crackled. Static, then a voice, incoming trauma. ETA for minutes. Naval training accident, multiple internal injuries. Trauma Bay 1. Elena stood. She placed her empty coffee cup in the sink, rinsed it with precision, set it upside down in the rack. The other nurses were already moving, already assembling the energy that came before a code. She moved toward the door, toward the trauma bay, toward the thing that was coming. That was when she saw Dr. Ashford in the hallway, talking to one of the residents. He turned, and his eyes found hers for just a moment. Long enough for her to see the calculation happening behind them, the way he was measuring something about her. The way his gaze dropped, just for an instant, to her neck. She was wearing the dog tag. Of course she was wearing the dog tag. She always wore it, had worn it for 18 years without anyone noticing, beneath her scrubs, on a chain that had broken during the convoy ambush in Ramadi, the one where she'd pulled a young boy, barely old enough to enlist, from a burning Humvee while rounds were still coming in. The dog tag had belonged to someone else, someone she'd tried to save who hadn't survived the shrapnel and the heat and the terrible mathematics of triage. She wore it the way other people wore wedding rings. As a vow. As a record. As a name for the ghosts. Ashford's eyes lingered. Just for a second. Just long enough that Elena felt the weight of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in 3 years. And what happened next would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. The trauma bay was waiting. The patient was coming. And Elena Martinez, the Band-Aid Queen, the invisible nurse, the woman nobody knew anything about, was about to walk into a room and see a face she'd spent 18 years trying not to remember, attached to a body that had survived something that shouldn't have been survivable. The floor beneath her feet felt solid. Her heartbeat was steady. Her hands, the hands that people mocked, the hands that had learned to save lives in a sandstorm with a combat knife and determination and the kind of training that came from watching people die and learning to do better, those hands would be ready. They didn't know who she was. Not yet. But in 4 minutes, someone was going to arrive who would. The gurney hit the emergency entrance doors at 11:24 a.m. on a Tuesday, and everything stopped. Not the kind of stop where people pause for a second, the kind where the whole world hiccups and forgets to breathe. Blood pooled beneath a man in dark tactical gear, his left side compressed with field dressings already soaked through. Navy SEAL, the paramedic called out. Training accident. 40 minutes out from the naval base. Unconscious. Lost 2 liters minimum. Elena was 3 steps down the corridor when she heard the call. She didn't turn. She kept walking, kept her hand steady, kept her face the blank canvas that 3 years of invisibility had taught her to maintain. Then she heard the resident's voice, "Get trauma bay open, full surgical team," and something in her chest tightened like a fist. She turned. The SEAL was already being transferred to the trauma bay stretcher, his face obscured by oxygen mask and the angle of the lift, but Elena's eyes tracked him anyway. Pure instinct. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it acts. The kind that comes from muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. The paramedic was reciting vitals: BP 88/52, heart rate 147, O2 sat 79 even with supplemental oxygen. Bad. Worse than bad. The kind of vital signs that meant minutes, not hours. Elena stepped into the bay. Her hands moved to grab fresh trauma shears from the tray without thinking. Around her, residents and attending physicians were positioning themselves, calling orders, the organized chaos of a level 1 trauma in full motion. The anesthesia fellow was calling for an RSI setup. The surgical resident was snapping sterile gloves. Elena cut away the SEAL's uniform and began assessment, her fingers cataloging damage with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Blast fragment wound, right flank. Penetrating trauma, likely splenic. The kind that needed an operating room in the next 8 minutes or the patient didn't leave it alive. She exposed his temple to check for other wounds, and the world stopped again. A scar curved along the left temporal bone, faint, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. A burn scar shaped like a question mark. She had seen that scar before. Had traced it with her own fingers 18 years ago in a burning Humvee in the Jolan district of Fallujah, her combat medic pack open on her lap as she'd worked to stabilize a bleeding kid who couldn't have been more than 19. The boy she'd pulled from wreckage. The boy she'd saved in the chaos of an ambush that had left 4 Marines dead and a question mark burned into his temple from the heat of the flames. Elena's hand moved toward her chest, toward the single dog tag hanging on a broken chain beneath her scrubs, before she could stop herself. Martinez. The voice cut across the trauma bay like a surgical blade. We need actual nurses here, not daydreamers. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway, his tablet already in hand, his gaze sharp and calibrated and wrong. He was watching her the way a programmer watches code for errors. His jaw tightened as he scanned the patient's file. Elena saw his fingers pause, saw the moment his eyes caught on the notation in the medical history. Previous combat injury, Ramadi 2004, a classified medical intervention. Redacted. His eyes flicked back to Elena. Held there. Calculated. The trauma team moved faster now, driven by the gravity of vitals and time. The SEAL was already heading toward the operating room, already being prepped for emergency thoracotomy if needed. Elena stepped back, her composure locked down so tightly she could feel her own heartbeat in her temples. She didn't follow him upstairs. She returned to the floor and began her routine work, charting, restocking, the invisible tasks that kept the hospital breathing. 2 hours later, the pages started coming through. The SEAL was stable. Internal bleeding controlled. Spleen salvaged. He was going to make it. Elena was at the nurse's station entering medication administration records when the overhead page crackled with deliberate volume. The kind of volume that made people look up from their screens. Can we get Martinez, the Band-Aid queen, to radiology? Apparently she's the only one who can hold a patient's hand and keep them calm. The laughter came fast, a resident snickering, a nurse from the day shift grinning, the easy cruelty of people who'd never had to prove anything beyond their credentials. Elena registered it the way a soldier registers incoming fire, noted it, catalogued it, dismissed it. She took one measured breath. Her face remained absolutely still. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't burn. She simply stood, walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and disappeared into the descending doors. The supply closet that afternoon was narrow and windowless, lined with metal shelves holding 4 bags and arterial lines and the small equipment that kept a hospital functioning. Elena was counting vials of normal saline when Dr. Ashford cornered her between the shelves, his presence sudden and complete, his voice dropped to the particular tone of a man who had learned to make threats sound like suggestions. "I saw you looking at that patient's file," Ashford said quietly. His voice had the texture of a tank idling in a garage, low, controlled, dangerous. "I saw you recognize something. Something you shouldn't have access to." Elena turned to face him. Their eyes met. Hers didn't flinch. "You're being transferred to night shift in the clinic, effective immediately." Ashford's words came out surgical and precise. Night shift. Basement clinic. Filing insurance claims and treating minor sprains. You'll stay away from the ICU, and you'll stay away from that patient. If I find out you've accessed his records again, or if I see you anywhere near his room, I will have your license pulled. Slowly. Permanently. You'll be emptying bedpans in a nursing home for the rest of your career. The fluorescent light above them hummed with the particular tone of something burning out. Elena didn't respond. Didn't justify. Didn't explain. She simply held his gaze for 3 more seconds, the amount of time it took for him to realize that his threat had landed without impact, then turned back to her inventory count. That evening, as the night shift began arriving, Elena was walking toward her car when Ashford caught up to her in the parking lot. The sky was already darkening, clouds rolling in from the gulf like a warning. There were 12 witnesses, nurses and residents and a security guard heading toward the ER entrance, when Ashford thrust a printed document into Elena's hands. "Performance issues," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Inappropriate emotional attachment to patients. You'll report to the clinic at 11 p.m. Elena looked at the demotion notice in her hands. Looked at the words, "Clinic reassignment, night shift, effective immediately." She felt the weight of every eye on her, the weight of the public humiliation, the weight of the person she'd been before Houston and the person she was pretending to be now. She took one measured breath. She let a single tear escape, just one, sliding down her cheek like an accident she couldn't control. Then she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Ashford, her hand moving with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to cry without falling apart. When she spoke, her voice came out quiet and absolute and clear as a command. "A real doctor would wonder why you're this afraid of a nurse." The parking lot went absolutely silent. Ashford's face darkened. His jaw clenched. He turned and walked away, his shoulders tight, his footsteps too hard on the concrete. Elena stood alone in the gathering darkness, the demotion notice still in her hands, rain beginning to fall like bullets against her skin. Around her, the arriving staff had already looked away, already moving, already pretending they hadn't witnessed something that had shifted the gravity in the lot. She walked to her car. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel and thought about muscle memory and masks and the precise moment when hiding became a form of violence. At 11 p.m., she reported to the basement clinic, a flickering space with outdated equipment and the kind of fluorescent lights that made everything look sick. Her new job was insurance forms and minor complaints and absolute distance from the ICU where the SEAL was sleeping off anesthesia and the woman who'd saved his life once before was confined to a basement processing paperwork like punishment. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding exactly why Ashford was this afraid of her. The basement clinic at Sacred Heart was a place where fluorescent tubes flickered like dying stars, each one a small stutter of light that made the room feel less like medicine and more like purgatory. Elena walked through the door at 11 o'clock at night, her shift reassignment paper still warm in her pocket, the red stamp of effective immediately burning through the scrub fabric like a brand. The inventory room smelled like stale plastic and something else, something chemical that caught in the back of her throat, the kind of smell that came from equipment left too long in humid darkness. She set her badge on the desk and stared at it for exactly 3 seconds before turning away. The night clinic occupied a basement corner of Sacred Heart, a space designed for the patients nobody wanted to deal with during day shift. Minor lacerations. Insurance processing. The drunk driver in Bay 3 who'd hit a lamppost on Richmond Avenue at 2 in the morning and had to be discharged before the paperwork got too complicated. Elena had worked floors with 12-bed rotations, with crash carts and central lines and the kind of critical care that made her hands move on their own. Now she was filing insurance claims under lights that buzzed like they were shorting out, and nobody in the hospital knew her name had just been erased from the ICU schedule. Ashford had been precise. Strategic. He hadn't fired her, not yet. He'd moved her to night shift, basement clinic, where the only traffic came through after midnight, where the phone didn't ring with stat consultations, where nobody from the ICU would think to page her. Where she was visible enough to still be an employee, but invisible enough that nobody would miss her. The basement was a professional death in slow motion, and he'd orchestrated every detail. By 6 in the evening, Elena had processed 47 insurance forms and treated 2 minor lacerations and talked an elderly woman through why her arthritis medication wouldn't show results overnight. The clinic was quiet enough to hear the hum of the HVAC system, the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing. She was finishing the last discharge paperwork when she heard it, voices from the hallway, the kind of urgent murmur that meant something had changed upstairs. She didn't move toward the door. Didn't stand. Didn't let her body betray what her mind already understood. A nurse she recognized from the morning shift passed by the clinic window, moving fast, her expression compressed into the tight control of someone carrying bad news. Elena watched her disappear down the hallway. Then another nurse. Then 2 residents in a conversation that was too clipped, too careful. The elevator dinged somewhere in the distance. An alarm started upstairs, faint from the basement, but unmistakable. The kind of alarm that meant a bed had just been marked critical. She kept working. Filled in the last insurance field. Printed the discharge summary. The rational part of her brain, the part that understood survival, understood that nothing good came from asking questions she wasn't supposed to know the answer to. She was a basement clinic nurse now. Whatever was happening for floors above wasn't her concern. Wasn't her job. Wasn't her responsibility anymore. The second alarm came at 6:17. Elena knew the hospital's call system like a language, different tones for different emergencies, each one a linguistic marker of urgency. This one was the kind of persistent bleat that meant code blue. Not a drill. The kind that made the world narrow down to a single point of focus. She heard it through the floor tiles, through the concrete, through the physics of sound traveling upward from a room where someone's heart had decided to stop. She didn't go to the stairs. Didn't run. Didn't move. At 6:22, a voice came through the overhead speaker, crackling with static, code blue, ICU room 7. Anesthesia to room 7. All available personnel to ICU. The voice was young, panicked. The voice of someone who'd trained for this but never believed it would happen on their shift. Elena's hands went very still on the keyboard. Room 7 was the trauma isolation room. The kind of room reserved for patients the hospital wanted to contain, to monitor, to keep away from the general population. The kind of room where they'd put a Navy SEAL with a head injury so severe that someone had already filed a redacted incident report. Room 7 was where they'd put him. She finished typing the patient name into the discharge summary and closed the file. She didn't move. Didn't stand. Didn't show her face at the basement window where anyone passing might see the exact moment she realized what was happening above her head. For 20 minutes, the alarm continued, not the sharp repeated tone of a fresh code, but the lower, more terrible sound of a code in progress, the sound of a room where compressions were ongoing and medications were being pushed and someone was dying one medication cycle at a time while residents and nurses moved in choreographed panic around a patient who was already making the transition from crisis to catastrophe. Elena sat in the basement clinic under the dying lights and listened to the hospital save a life, or lose one, somewhere for floors above where she was no longer allowed to work. At 6:45, the overhead alarm stopped. The silence that followed was worse, not the absence of sound, but the presence of conclusion. Whatever had been happening was either resolved or over. Elena didn't know which. She sat at the desk with her hands flat on the laminate surface and made herself breathe like a normal person, like someone who didn't recognize that particular sequence of alerts, like she hadn't already diagnosed the problem by sound alone. The door to the basement clinic opened at 7:13. Elena was still sitting at the desk, discharge paperwork organized into neat stacks, her posture exactly what it needed to be, present but not engaged, visible but not intrusive. Ashford appeared in the doorway with his coat already draped over his arm, his shift apparently ending at the moment he needed it to end. "Martinez." His voice was different now. Lighter. Like a man who'd handled a situation. "I wanted to make sure you understood the new schedule. Night shift. 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Basement clinic only. Your badge won't activate access to any floors above the ground level." He paused, watching her face. Waiting for something. "Do you understand?" Elena looked up at him. Made eye contact for exactly 2 seconds, not defiant, just acknowledging. "Understood, doctor." "Good." He nodded, satisfied. "The night crew will be in at 7. You're to handle routine clinic intake only. Any emergencies get paged to the on-call physician. Not to you." "Understood." "Yes." He turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. "You did good work before, Martinez. But sometimes good nurses know their limits. You should too." He said it like a man offering advice, like a mentor trying to save her from herself. Like he believed his own narrative about what was happening. "Go home. Get some rest. The clinic reopens at 7 tomorrow evening." She sat alone in the basement clinic for another 48 minutes, finishing inventory, logging out the remaining equipment, ensuring every form was filed exactly where it was supposed to be. When she stood to leave at 8 o'clock, the basement was empty except for the emergency lighting and the faint mechanical breath of the fax system. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, her shoulder burning where the shrapnel had never healed quite right, where the scar tissue protested the weight of her own arm. The parking lot was empty except for the night shift cars and the cleaning crew vehicles. Elena stood at the bus stop with the cardboard box balanced on her hip, 3 years of personal items, the hospital mug that had come from the cafeteria's opening day, a succulent that had turned brown from the fluorescent lights never quite being the right kind of sun, a unit photograph from Ramadi where half the faces had already been crossed by sand and time, and things that didn't have names. Rain started coming down at 8:15, not the kind that fell straight but the kind that moved sideways, the kind that seemed personal. Elena didn't move from the bus stop. Didn't open the cardboard box to protect the photograph. Just stood there with her uniform still on, the Sacred Heart logo on her left shoulder, the name badge long since removed, rain dripping off the edge of the box and disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. She thought about the alarm. About room 7. About the resident's voice cracking over the speaker at 6:22. She thought about a Navy SEAL who was either alive or dead, either breathing on his own or on a ventilator, either recovering or being prepared for someone to tell his family the kind of news that nobody should have to deliver. She thought about Ashford's voice in the basement, light and satisfied, like a man who'd controlled a situation perfectly. Like a man who'd made sure that nobody could get in his way. The bus came at 8:41. Elena climbed on with the cardboard box. The driver didn't ask her if she'd had a good shift. The people sitting in the back didn't ask why she was soaking wet or carrying a dead plant or wearing hospital scrubs with the name patch removed. She found a seat and put the box on her lap and watched Sacred Heart's lights receding in the darkness. For floors of ICU she was no longer allowed to access, a patient she wasn't allowed to help, a hospital that was already forgetting her name. What she didn't know was that the SEAL's pressure had dropped to 70/40 at 6:40, that the blood pressure was still falling at 6:50, that the resident in the room was calling for an attending who wasn't answering the page because Ashford had already decided the patient was a liability instead of a problem that could be solved. What she didn't know was that in 34 minutes, everything would change. The code blue alarm screamed at 6:51 p.m., a sound that cut through for floors of Sacred Heart Hospital like artillery fire. Elena was restocking the basement clinic supply closet when the overhead page crackled, Code Blue, ICU Room 7. Code Blue, ICU Room 7. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her head as her entire body went still. Not a flinch. Not a tremor. Just a pause that lasted 2 seconds, the kind of pause that comes from recognizing your own heartbeat in someone else's chest. She moved toward the stairwell before the second announcement finished. The basement clinic was empty, the night shift hadn't arrived yet, and she took the concrete stairs 3 at a time, her muscle memory overriding the termination letter she'd signed 2 hours earlier, overriding protocol, overriding everything Ashford had designed to keep her isolated for floors below where she couldn't interfere. Her shoulder screamed with old pain. The shrapnel from Ramadi never fully healed, just learned to quiet down between crises. This wasn't between crises anymore. The 4th floor hallway was controlled chaos, nurses running, the crash cart already in motion, a resident she didn't recognize barking orders that came out as questions instead of commands. The ICU Room 7 door was open. She walked in without stopping, without announcing herself, and took in the scene in the time it took to breathe once, the SEAL's chest cavity filling with blood like a bathtub with the drain plugged, pressure on the monitor dropping toward flatline like a stone down a well, the resident frozen at the bedside with a syringe in his trembling hand. "Step back," Elena said. Not a request. Not even loud. Just the voice of someone who had watched 17 people bleed out before she learned how to stop it. The resident turned, his face pale as bone. "We need to wait for an attending. We need to." Elena was already at the crash cart, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this exact thing in a sandstorm under fire, while mortar rounds landed close enough to shake loose teeth. The scalpel felt right in her grip. Everything felt right. This was the part of her that Ashford's transfer couldn't reach. This was the part that lived in her hands. O2 sat is 58 and falling, a nurse called out. Pressure 65/38. Elena made the incision between the 5th and 6th ribs with a movement so economical it looked like she was opening a letter instead of a chest cavity. The resident made a sound like a caught animal. Elena didn't acknowledge it. Her left hand was already spreading the ribs, feeling for the anatomy beneath blood and chaos, her fingers finding the torn vessel exactly where she knew it would be because she had done this with a K-bar knife in Ramadi when there were no instruments and 3 lives depended on her steady hands. Blood sprayed. The monitor shrieked. A nurse thrust a rib spreader into her hand and Elena clamped it into place with movements that belonged to muscle memory instead of conscious thought. This was the opposite of the basement clinic. This was everything she had been trained for. This was why they had kept her alive through shrapnel and infection and 18 years of pretending to be smaller than she was. "Clamp!" "Now," she said, and the attending who had suddenly appeared, where had he come from, how long had she been working, was it 30 seconds or 3 minutes, handed her a vascular clamp without being asked twice. The vessel clamped. The bleeding stopped like someone closing a valve. The monitor's scream became a rhythm again. Not normal yet. Not safe yet. But rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The most beautiful sound in the world except for the quiet that came after, the 7-second silence where nobody moved and nobody breathed and the only sound was the ventilator's mechanical whisper. Elena released the clamp slowly, watching the pressure hold, watching the pulse remain steady. 62 on the monitor. 63. Stabilizing. The shoulder wound in her chest that had never quite healed stopped screaming and went back to its usual quiet burn. "Pressure's holding," the nurse said. Her voice shook. Elena nodded once and stripped her gloves. They were soaked in blood that wasn't hers. They made a sound like a gunshot when she snapped them into the red biohazard bag. She turned toward the door and that's when she saw him. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway with his face the color of fresh gauze. His mouth opened and closed. Opened and closed again. Then he disappeared down the hallway faster than Elena had ever seen him move, his footsteps echoing toward the stairwell. 30 seconds later, Elena could count them because she was timing everything now, timing how long she had before the machinery of institutional power caught up with her, security arrived. 2 of them, solid men with the look of people who'd been trained to follow orders without asking why, and behind them came the chief of staff and a hospital administrator she'd seen once in the cafeteria. The chief of staff was holding a folder that she recognized before he opened it. Termination letter. Already printed. Her name typed out in perfect Arial font. Ms. Martinez, the chief of staff began, and Elena noticed he'd downgraded her title. Not even nurse anymore. Just Ms. You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure in violation of hospital protocol, resident scope of practice guidelines, and state medical board regulations. You are terminated effective immediately for insubordination and unlicensed surgical practice. The words fell into the hallway like stones into still water. Elena didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She'd known this was coming the moment Ashford disappeared down the stairwell. She'd known it when she made the incision. Maybe she'd known it when he'd handed her the transfer notice in the parking lot yesterday. Your hospital ID, please, the chief of staff said. Elena reached into her scrub pocket where the dog tag still hung on its broken chain, where it had hung for 18 years, hidden under her shirt. She pulled out the ID instead and handed it over without meeting anyone's eyes. Not because she was afraid. Because she'd learned 18 years ago that you don't give people the satisfaction of seeing you flinch. A supervisor appeared with safety scissors and cut the ID in half at the nurse's station while the night shift nurses watched in silence. The scissors made a sound like a rifle bolt closing. Elena's photo split down the middle. Suddenly she was two halves of someone who didn't exist anymore. She walked to her locker in the basement, the same locker she'd used for 3 years, and packed her belongings into a cardboard box. The cracked mug that someone had given her as a joke, world's okayest nurse, went in. The dying succulent that had somehow survived despite her neglect. A photo of her unit in Ramadi, half the faces crossed by sand and time and the things that happened in desert heat that didn't make the news. Her shift change jacket. The things that people leave behind when they vanish. The rain started while she was standing at the bus stop, a soft Houston rain that meant nothing was over, just that it was going to be wet and difficult for a while. The cardboard box sagged in her hands as the bottom began to give way. Water soaked through the corrugated edges. She should have brought a bag. She should have planned better. She should have walked away before she'd ever climbed those stairs. But she hadn't. And as she stood there in the rain with her life dissolving in a cardboard box, Elena Martinez didn't know that somewhere on the 4th floor, a Navy SEAL was waking up for the first time in 72 hours with a clear head and steady vitals. She didn't know that he was gripping a young intern's wrist so hard it would bruise purple by morning. She didn't know that his next 4 words would set in motion something that would start before dawn and not stop until careers ended and federal agents filled the lobby and the helicopter rotors shook the windows hard enough to crack them. She just stood at a bus stop in Houston, Texas, in the rain, alone with a box of broken things, waiting for a bus that would take her somewhere else entirely. The Black Hawk descended through Houston darkness like a predator settling onto its prey. Rotor wash scattered debris across Sacred Heart's painted parking lines, a plastic bag cartwheeling across asphalt, a nurse's clipboard tumbling end over end, rain scattering sideways in sheets. The aircraft skids touched down at 5:41 a.m. The rotors continued their mechanical scream for another 12 seconds before the pilot cut the engines. Silence rushed in like a held breath finally released. 2 officers in dress uniforms emerged from the belly of the helicopter, their brass catching the parking lot's amber lights. Class A dress blues. Both colonels. Both moving with the kind of purposeful stride that made orderlies instinctively step aside. They didn't walk toward the lobby. They cut directly through the emergency entrance like they owned the hallway. "Where is Major Elena Martinez?" the first colonel demanded, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Call sign Reaper 6. Now." The night shift nurses froze. One dropped a chart. Another's hand went to her mouth. Nobody answered because nobody understood the question. A major. Reaper 6. This was a floor nurse who pushed medication carts and changed bedpans. This was the invisible woman in rumpled scrubs who never spoke above a whisper. In the ICU, 3 floors above the commotion, the Navy SEAL's eyes opened. Marcus Webb had been sedated for 19 hours. The ventilator had been his only voice. But something in the hospital's air had changed, a vibration in the walls, a shift in atmospheric pressure that even drugged consciousness could register. He gripped the nearest intern's wrist with the strength of a man just remembering what his body could do. "The Major," he whispered, his voice raw from the endotracheal tube. "The Major saved my life in Ramadi when I was 8. Find her. Now." The intern stared at this man, massive, tattooed, his left side wrapped in surgical gauze, and had no idea what language he was speaking. But the grip on his wrist said it wasn't a request. By 5:54 a.m., a trembling HR clerk named Patricia was pulling Elena's file from the locked cabinets in the basement office. Patricia's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the folder twice. The military override code had come through at 5:51, a federal authorization that made every classified section suddenly readable. The redactions vanished like they'd never existed. Combat Surgeon, Major Elena Martinez. Call sign, Reaper 6. 17 field surgeries documented under hostile fire. Purple Heart. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 Silver Stars. Medical discharge following penetrating trauma to left shoulder, Ramadi, 2005. Classified notation, surgical intervention during convoy ambush, Fallujah corridor. 32 civilians extracted. 1 subject, 8-year-old Marcus Webb, pulled from vehicle fire by Major Martinez. Patricia's face went pale. She was holding the file of a legend. A ghost. A woman who had been arranging bedpans in the basement clinic. The hospital lobby at 6:03 a.m. was cathedral quiet, that early morning silence before the day shift arrived. But the 2 colonels had company now. Standing between them was a Navy SEAL team leader, younger than the colonels but carrying the kind of authority that made age irrelevant. His scar ran from temple to jaw. His eyes were the color of winter ice. He opened his mouth, and his voice carried to every floor of Sacred Heart Hospital. "Major Martinez has 2 silver stars," he said. Each word landed like a hammer strike. "Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. She performed 17 field surgeries under fire before she was wounded, saving my predecessor's life. She pulled an 8-year-old child from a burning vehicle during a convoy ambush in Fallujah." His pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. "That child is awake upstairs. And he's asking for her." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the ventilation system's mechanical breathing through the vents. Dr. Ashford had been summoned to the lobby at 6:08. He arrived wearing the expression of a man who didn't yet understand he was already dead. When he saw the colonel's brass, his face went gray. When the Navy SEALs team leader began speaking, Ashford's knees visibly buckled. By the 4th sentence, "She performed 17 field surgeries under fire," Ashford was backing away. Not walking. Backing. His heel caught the edge of a floor tile. He nearly fell. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating in air. The IT director appeared from the side corridor, a Marine veteran named Holloway who ran the hospital's security systems. He carried a hard drive in one hand and an expression carved from granite. "Dr. Ashford," Holloway said, his voice carrying the razor-edge precision of a man who'd given orders in 3 war zones. "You tried to delete security footage at 3:44 a.m. last Tuesday. You thought the system was offline." Ashford's face went the color of old bone. "I back up every frame to an off-site server," Holloway continued. "I saw you in the security office. I knew what you were." He opened a laptop resting on the lobby's main desk. Security footage filled the screen. Frame after frame. Ashford's hands in the system. Ashford's face, clear as a photograph, entering Elena's access codes into the termination database. Ashford's voice on the recorded line to the medical board. "Every crime, documented in high definition. Every frame has been forwarded to the state medical board. The FBI arrived at my office at 4:22 a.m. with a warrant." Ashford made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The hospital's chief of staff appeared from the administrative corridor, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Behind her, the hospital's attorney carried a folder marked with federal seals. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. By 6:02 a.m., Ashford's medical license was under federal suspension pending investigation. His hospital privileges were terminated with immediate effect. His name appeared in a preliminary federal indictment for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The FBI agent, a woman with eyes like gun barrels, explained that his payments for burying the Ramadi report had come directly traceable to a defense contractor covering up equipment failures that caused the original ambush. The contractor was already under federal indictment. So was Ashford. By 9:03 a.m., 3 pharmaceutical companies had dropped him from their consulting contracts. His medical liability insurance had been cancelled. The Bar Association had been notified. His attorney stopped returning calls at 9:15. Elena was reinstated by unanimous board decision at 9:02 a.m. Not just reinstated. Offered a position that had never existed before. Chief of Emergency Medicine. With full authority to rebuild the culture of her department. With an apology written on hospital letterhead from the board chairman himself. In the ICU, Marcus Webb recovered fully from his injuries. The internal bleeding was controlled. The lung damage was healing. By day 4, he was breathing on his own, sitting up, asking for water. On day 5, Elena was permitted to visit him. She stood in the doorway of his room, still wearing her scrubs because she'd come directly from the emergency department. 17 hours into her new position. 3 critical cases already stabilized. 1 minor league transformation already underway in the department's culture, a single quiet woman arriving and every single person sitting straighter, speaking softer, remembering why they'd gone into medicine in the first place. Marcus Webb stared at her for 8 full seconds before he recognized the younger version of the woman who'd saved him in a burning vehicle. Then he cried. This was a Navy SEAL, a combat operative trained to function in conditions of extreme stress, and he wept like a child. He reached for his neck and pulled out a single dog tag on a chain, not a new chain, but the original, repaired and retied 100 times. You told me, he whispered, that warriors always come home. Elena sat beside his bed without speaking. She never mentioned that she'd broken the original chain pulling him from the fire. That she'd spent 18 years wondering if he'd survived. That the dog tag had been hers, given to an 8-year-old boy in the chaos of Ramadi with blood on her hands and certainty in her voice. Some things don't require words. 6 months later, Elena walked past a strip mall on her way to work. The morning was bright. The kind of clear Houston day where the sky looked infinite. She was thinking about her first class of residents, about the weekly morning briefings she'd started, about the patient satisfaction scores that had climbed 17 points in 6 months. Then she saw him. Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table under a banner reading "Get insured today, low rates." The suit he wore was cheaper now. His shoes were worn at the heels. His hands arranged pamphlets in neat rows, pamphlets that nobody took. People walked past him like he was part of the landscape, like he was invisible. He looked up. Recognition crossed his face. Then shame. Then something worse, the realization that he'd become the exact thing he despised in Elena. Invisible. Powerless. Forgotten. Elena didn't slow her stride. She didn't acknowledge him. Her eyes fixed forward, past him, toward the future that had continued without him. She walked into Sacred Heart's main entrance where her nameplate hung on the directory, Dr. Elena Martinez, Chief of Emergency Medicine. The hospital had paid for her to complete medical school, an accelerated program for combat medics with records like hers. 2 years instead of 4. The examination boards had waived prerequisites. The military medical credentials translated perfectly. In her office, the photograph from Ramadi hung on the wall beside her framed silver stars. The hospital had found the photo in her personnel file, Elena in desert camouflage, her left shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages, holding a surgical kit in steady hands. She was 26 years old in that photograph. She looked immortal. Marcus Webb's dog tag sat on her desk in a small glass case, the chain repaired with surgical steel that would never break again. That evening, Elena stood in Sacred Heart's auditorium before a class of 40 nursing students. She wore her white coat now, and the students sat at attention like they were in the presence of something they couldn't quite define. She told them about Ramadi. She told them about the 17 surgeries performed in a field hospital built from sandbags and determination. She told them about the 8-year-old boy pulled from fire. She told them about being invisible in Houston, about the humiliation, about the rain and the cardboard box with a dying succulent and the photograph of a unit where half the faces were already gone. You will be underestimated, she told them, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd survived on being underestimated. You will be called names. You will be told you're not qualified, not experienced, not enough. Someone will try to break you. Someone will fail. Her final words came out in a voice like steel drawn across stone. True class is what you do when the lights go out. The auditorium erupted in standing ovation. 40 future nurses rose to their feet, and the sound of their applause echoed off every wall. Outside, in the strip mall parking lot, Dr. Ashford packed his unsold pamphlets as the sun set. He worked alone. He would always work alone now. He folded the banner that nobody read and placed it in the trunk of a car that needed new paint. He drove home to an apartment that smelled like regret and disappeared into a future no one would ever document. Elena stood at her office window, watching the city lights emerge as darkness settled. Through the glass, she could see the parking lot where the Black Hawk had landed. She could hear the phantom sound of those rotors, that mechanical roar that had announced to the world who she'd always been. Her new resident knocked. There was a trauma case in Bay 3. A motorcycle collision. Moderate shock. Possible internal bleeding. Elena turned from the window. The girl in the scrubs was gone. The major was back. She moved toward the trauma bay like a predator settling onto its prey. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and overdue recognition. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated. Comment below, what would you have done in Elena's position?